So welcome back to the Global Mindfulness and Education Summit. I'm Dr. Chris Willard, and I'm hosting an interview with psychologist, author, Dr. Rick Hanson. I am so delighted to be talking to Dr. Hanson. Rick, if I may, we've just been kind of chatting already for a while about ideas, so I'm even more excited about this conversation. But Rick's written a number of books folks are probably familiar with, the Buddha's Brain being one that I've read probably 6 or 7 times. Resilient, is that Hardwiring Happiness, also another phenomenal book, and is working on something really exciting too that I'm sure you'll hear about as he's speaking. But I'll just give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, Rick, and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, Chris, it has been a complete delight to talk with you before we began with the recorder on. And I will just say about my own background that I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I started meditating in 1974. So I've been at it for a while. And I've, kind of come through a lot of different ways and trainings, and my own focus is really practical. So I'm really happy to have this conversation with you and talk about how to help people, including how to help families. As I mentioned to you before we started, I also have a background with families, parent education, transition to parenthood, child development. My dissertation was on 15-month-olds. The full catastrophe, maybe, of parenting, as John Kabat-Zinn might put it.
Right.
So anyway, I'm very happy to be here. Just want to be helpful.
Yeah, great. And that was such a delight to learn that we both have this background in early childhood education and family development and all of that. So I guess I'd be curious kind of to hear maybe at first a little bit about how did you, besides being a child of the 60s and 70s, like where did this path begin for you with mindfulness? And one question I always find really interesting is maybe even just asking what to you was mindfulness before mindfulness? Like, did you have experiences even as a kid? Like I think back to just like listening to the sounds of trees or watching clouds in the sky that were not exactly mindfulness, but something contemplative for sure. Like, when did that journey begin, and when did it start to formalize for you?
I've been reflecting a fair amount lately. I joke that I'm in late middle age. Looking
very early
on my life. And it's very present in my earliest memories. This kind of wallpaper around the experience in the background is this wistful, poignant feeling that there's so much unnecessary unhappiness in the people around, especially in the people around me. Internally, I felt peaceful and loving and curious and sorrowful that it was like this. And so for me, really early, literally memories from 2 and 3 years old, is this background feeling of, wow, why are you so unhappy? Well, and that kind of, and then the heart's movement, as you know well,
right,
to want to help. So I guess I began as, the Buddha might put it, with the first noble truth of suffering, or as maybe more accurate translations would put it, the ennobling, the truth of suffering, the facing of suffering in ourselves and others. And in my childhood, I was quite unhappy for a variety of reasons. Nobody's fault, really, just a lot of things came together in my childhood. And so that set me on my way from a pretty early age to try to sort out, how to be less miserable and awkward and lonely and ashamed of myself, and how to grow. So that took me into spiritual practice pretty early. I encountered first the human potential movement, California in the early 70s, and then the spiritual traditions from the East. So that took me into a meditative practice, as I said, that was kind of Buddhist in its roots. That journey took me there. But when I think back on the essence of the process, it had these 2 qualities that I think of as the 2 wings of the bird of practice, being with what's there and working with what's there.
Right.
It just seems so fundamental. And we need to be mindful either way. We need to be little bit mindfulness is present when we just be with our experience, the sound in the trees, the feeling of this breath. We're simply being with it. But that's not the entirety of practice. We also need to work with it, right? The bird needs 2 wings to fly. The elements of wise effort, really, releasing what's painful and harmful and growing what's beneficial and enjoyable for ourselves and other people. And that's kind of where I started. I would say I was in my 20s. Really quickly, I began to appreciate that staying present in the moment was absolutely central. If we're swept away into the future or the past, we can't either be with our experience or work with it, either way. So that present moment quality of mindfulness came in really early for me. And I would just say, as the years have gone by, what's become what's been a really important theme in my life, and I guess in my work as well, is the transition from states to traits. It's interesting. For example, I've been like you, I've spent a lot of time in classrooms. Your typical third grade teacher or high school teacher has a theory based on real training of how kids learn. And in fact, also what students can do to be active learners inside their own minds to become better at fill in the blank, English, history, social, mathematics, and so forth. Fine. On the other hand, almost no psychologists or therapists or coaches or mindfulness teachers or or self-help teachers, certainly not the field altogether, has a comparable theory in the territory of social, emotional, even spiritual training.
Right.
We don't have a theory of how the mind and really the brain changes through the experiences people are having, and in particular, how people can be active learners themselves in their own personal healing, growth, and transformation. And that's the movement fundamentally from states to traits. In other words, third grade teachers are experts on moving from state to trait in an academic domain. And yet it's remarkable, isn't it, that in a social, emotional, motivational, somatic, spiritual sphere, we have very little understanding of how people can engage their own experiences moment to moment to actually develop trait mindfulness.
Right.
Or trait compassion, or trait commitment to social justice. And that's the hardwiring aspect that's been deeply interesting to me professionally as well as personally. How can we actually steepen our growth curve through this life?
And are you, one of the ideas of this online summit is to hear from people that are doing this work in so many different places. And I know, we were kind of chit-chatting before, and also some of the research that you're doing now. Like, are you finding that there are places that there are either organizations or ancient practices or contemporary practices in different places, in different cultures, that are really actively and systematically cultivating these values from states into traits that maybe are universal, or that are possible through the science, as we're seeing and learning all about the brain and our physiology so rapidly in the last few years?
Yeah. So I've spent a lot of time in Europe and a fair amount as well in Australia and New Zealand. And I'm quite aware of things that are happening, for example, in Singapore in this territory. So I would say my experience is predominantly in the Western world. I'm also in correspondence with many people from Latin America and also South Africa to some extent. So I have some limited sense of that. You probably have more sense of that than I do. One thing that has struck me is that in many ways, I think Europe is certainly ahead of America in terms of mindfulness, including at the policy level. I think something like a large number of members of parliament have actually gone through a mindfulness training there. And it's just almost unimaginable to think that
given the news as we're recording this,
as beneficial as it would be. So I think that I see that. Maybe a point I'd like to make, kind of a twofold point, is that the Buddha did not invent mindfulness, nor has the modern secular mindfulness movement. Kindergarten teachers, I think back on these, you've probably seen the equivalent in classrooms. Pay attention,
right.
Be nice, share your toys.
Right.
And it starts with pay attention, right? So there's a universal quality of that, and you see it in parents as well. So I think it's really important to appreciate how in different cultures and in different traditions, including, very importantly, the first people, the indigenous cultures of the world, how they approach mindfulness as well. And to draw upon that, not in any exploitive way,
Right.
not cultural appropriation and so forth,
Right.
but in a very respectful way, actually,
Right.
to bring a beginner's mind to ourselves.
Yeah.
To how a priest in Brazil or a shaman in Alaska or a rabbi in Manhattan is doing mindfulness in their way.
And cultivating similar states into traits.
And that's
seeds. Yeah.
That's right. So I think that's really important. As a quick sidebar, without being reductionistic about it, looking at this through the lens of the universal brain that we all share, the body we have, the DNA we all share, it gives us a kind of a common framework inside the natural frame, ordinary conditioned reality, for what could be similar in what's actually happening in terms of states and traits of experiences that are being talked about in very different ways. So that's one notion I have. The other I have about this, when I think about the multicultural aspects, if you will, of mindfulness, is to always keep in mind there's an admonition in Zen, nothing left out, right? And yet we can't help but leave things out. Our views are always privileged or parochial. I say that, parochial. They're always partial. And so I think it's also useful to be aware of how we can get trapped in our worldview, which seems so self-evident to us. Like, again, before we began, you and I were talking about how in the West, whose predominant religion actually is science in a lot of ways, it's just taken as self-evident that anyone who would think it's necessary to engage the transcendental is probably superstitious and to be pitied at best and detained at worst. On the other hand, for most people in the world, they're engaging these practices in some ways, often in the context of a religious framework. And so I just think that's an example of the importance of recognizing the ways in which our frameworks shape how we approach mindfulness.
Right.
And to not just
science itself is it's just one cultural lens. My wife is a medical historian, a historian of science. So she's always reminding me that it's like, we're not going to believe this science. We think this science is the only science, is the only way. We're not going to be looking at it this way in 100 years even. And, we can see how, and that's not just the growth of new, methodologies and new measurements and new brain scanners, but just like and as you say, we're in the minority that we're seeing this in only within that particular context and not within the context of something transcendental, unmeasurable by Western scientific, measuring devices and instruments.
Yeah. I will say though, what's wonderful about mindfulness is that it's kind of a corrective to that, because it draws people so immediately into just what's it like to be you right now.
Right.
You know? And it comes out of what the Buddha called the thicket of views. It comes right into the immediacy of the moment. And that, as I think about it, does tend to pull us out of our cultural and conceptual frameworks, and it brings us into the immediacy of this moment as it is for us, in its suchness, in its richness.
And the investigation of that too. Right. And in that sort of almost subjective scientific investigation and come and see for ourselves and all that as we investigate ourselves. So
I find that there's such a sweet moment. I mean, I think that a lot of practice, especially as practice matures, becomes increasingly surrendered to the moment as it is, utterly open to it, present in it as it empties out continuously. And along the way, the journey does involve many sweet little moments, I think, in which you're very receptive, you're very present with the moment, in an intimacy with it, while from time to time, as wholesome, beneficial things flow through consciousness, an insight, an intention, a softening, a releasing, an emerging of a lovingness or a gratitude or a peacefulness, that in a sweet way, we, without getting all thingifying about it and attached to it, we help it sink in a little bit. We help it sink in a little bit so that we help ourselves in this state to trait growth process, both be letting go as the moment arises while receiving into ourselves, leaving lasting physical traces behind in our nervous system. What is actually beneficial in the moment that we're having. And that's a really interesting place to receive while letting go.
Right.
In a way that's informed by care and wisdom for yourself. And then as teachers and as parents and educators, help our kids do the same.
Right. There's something about, I'm kind of resonating still with the word intimacy that you used and softening, and just thinking about how, I'm trying to figure out like, well, why is mindfulness so, this is exciting everywhere in the world you go, people are excited about this. And it's because I think, multitasking, our devices, our screens, whatever, are in many ways, like, I was thinking like, I am intimate just because of my phone. I'm intimate with so many less things. I am, it keeps me less close and intimate with friendships, with relationships. It interferes with that human intimacy. It interferes with intimacy with myself, with just being with my thoughts, being with myself. And going back to, those sort of childhood experiences, intimacy with nature, intimacy with the world, intimacy with the planet. Yeah. And what mindfulness does is it creates this intimacy, this affection, and this softening as we have that give and take. And it's so powerful. And there's just something about that word that really struck a chord.
It's funny you say that, because I love how you put that intimacy with ourselves, right? And there's a homecoming in that. It reminds me of the saying that all sickness at bottom is homesickness.
Right.
There's something kind of profound about that,
Yeah.
And so, lately I've been just reflecting on refuge and the feeling of refuge, that just what it feels like, whether you're an animal finally making it back to your burrow, or crawling into bed yourself late at night, or coming home after a long trip and just dropping your suitcases and going, boy, here we are, right? Or we find refuge in other ways too, but it's that feeling. And my own background in what could be called evolutionary neuropsychology, that's a mouthful, has really helped me appreciate, in terms of our animal nature, how important shelter is, how important refuge is. And animals, non-human animals, obviously in the wild, have to balance foraging, going out for resources, which then exposes them to threats.
Right.
But if they don't go out, they'll starve to death. So how do they balance that tension?
Right.
And so again, in terms of attachment psychology, right? Children are from a secure base, right? What's our internalized secure base?
Right.
Our internalized refuge that we can come home to again and again. And I think mindfulness really helps us in that way.
Yeah.
While also I just want to encourage the internalization of that felt sense of homecoming and refuge, and the comfort in it, and the feeling of shelter in it, and an opportunity for refueling, to really flag that experience while people are meditating or being mindful in other ways.
Yeah.
Not just letting it wash through the brain like water through a sieve, but slowing it down for a breath or two or three to really receive into yourself again and again that feeling of homecoming.
And I think, I think there's so many ways to translate that, and thinking about it in some ways as attachment. I've been thinking a lot about attachment lately, and, kind of what happens as we practice mindfulness and compassion and self-compassion and kind of learn to reparent ourselves. And I think about this a lot as I'm working with parents and with educators about how they're, hopefully parenting in a way that's creating secure attachments, or for educators that they need to in some ways be reparenting and they become attachment figures. And that's, a hefty burden, but it's also an incredible responsibility. And it's a benefactor role in a sense, if we, look back to the Dharma. And thinking about attachment also as, and again, what I hope that kids can develop is a secure attachment to caregivers. But I think about kids that have been through a trauma and needing secure attachment to themselves.
Yeah.
And I think also I've been thinking a lot about, I feel very lucky, the two of us were kind of talking about kind of our privilege before this, but it's like, I am lucky enough to, because of my various identity markers, I have a secure attachment to our larger culture. And I think a lot of people that have been marginalized, they've had a traumatic and insecure attachment, a highly disrupted attachment to the larger culture that said, you don't belong, or there's something wrong with you, or this or that. And so learning how we can all find that secure base within ourselves and build out from there to other caregivers or, sort of families of choice or kind of relationships that we build. And that mindfulness and related contemplative practices, I kind of use mindfulness in a larger sense of all of these kinds of practices can help us to build that attachment to ourselves, security in ourselves. My friend Amy Saltzman would say the still quiet place within, right? But then that allows us to really effectively and healthily learn how to connect with others.
That's deeply interesting. And yeah, it's funny. My family background, to some extent, especially on my father's side, comes through North Dakota and ranchers. My dad was born on a ranch in 1918, and he just passed away a few years ago, actually, after a very long and very rich life that had seen so many changes. And there's this essence in many cultures of self-reliance. Mm-hmm. And, some of the translations of, like the final teachings of the Buddha are things like be a light unto yourself. And another different translation would be something like, walk the path with care. Mm-hmm. Right? And so in a way, to me, what you're talking about is the opportunity we have, regardless of what's happening around us, to develop that secure base inside no matter what. Mm-hmm. And we may have a lot of work to do. We may have a lot of work to do that, and yet no one can stop us from doing it. Right. It's like the temple of our own minds. No one can stop us. That gradual, breath by breath, synapse by synapse, development of that internalized, I call it an unshakable core, deep down inside yourself. And we gradually build it out so that we don't just experience that unshakable core when all the lights on the dashboard of reality are green, but even when a lot of them are flashing red, we still retain that sense of fundamental equanimous well-being, resilient well-being inside ourselves that's not invaded by things that happen. And I find that incredibly hopeful, including at this moment in the world. On the one hand, I'd rather be alive today. I'd rather take my chances today in the lottery of a birth than 100 years ago. 1,000 years ago, with all the world's issues today.
More work to do.
Well, I'd rather be here today than Dickens' London, right? Or true. Europe 1,000 years ago, or Asia, let's say. So my point is, I just find that really hopeful that no one can stop us from doing that work inside our minds, even as the external sources of support seem pretty shaky. Mm-hmm. And are being attacked in a variety of ways, and actually actively attacked, which is a thing, in my view, morally to really stand against. But that said, meanwhile, we have the opportunity to practice ourselves every breath, every day. And no one can stop us, and no one can do it for us.
Right. What do you see as the kind of, in this really challenging time we're living in, what do you think are going to be the challenges of, again, the sort of like larger definition of mindfulness, but, these contemplative practices, what are going to be the challenges of moving this kind of movement, this interest forward? What are you seeing as, I guess, both challenges, but also opportunities? I think science presents a lot of opportunities, although limited in some ways, but what do you think are going to be the challenges?
I think it's always a challenge to not let the dominant, very powerful forces in any society co-opt different forms of mental training for their own purposes. And I think that I'm myself kind of a moderate about the whole secular mindfulness movement. I'm not troubled that these ideas and methods have been extracted from what could be called a religious tradition, and now they're being applied in corporate wellness programs or being used to teach soldiers how to go through battle without getting PTSD, for example. I mean, on the other hand, I think we have to be really attentive to the ways in which, especially large organizations, love ways in which they can help their workers become a little more resilient so they don't have to actually change their corporate culture, or we don't have to look hard at late industrial capitalism. So I think on one hand, we need to be careful about that. On the other hand, and I would just add a second point, which is that there's no replacement for a moral view. In other words, mindfulness is a wonderful state of being. Let's not forget, as people have said, that burglars and snipers can be very mindful. So it's including the original teachings of Buddhist psychology over 2,000 years ago. It was seen as a neutral factor. Mindfulness is a neutral factor. It needs to be used for a good purpose. So we need to keep bringing in the moral view that there's no replacement for values. The naturalistic fallacy, is to move from is to ought. Just because mindfulness enables us to feel certain ways or to be in certain ways doesn't necessarily mean that will be beneficial. We need to bring values to it as well. So I think that's really important.
And I think that's such an interesting question. We're talking a little bit about a book I did a few years ago that was trying to translate not just mindfulness to kids, but actually translate a lot of these other values that are actually cultivated first in at least Eastern traditions of mindfulness. You cultivate all these other values, and then you start messing around with mindfulness a little bit, so that again, it's sort of in the service of good, or hopefully with the right intention of some kind. And I think that's really, so I was trying to translate these values. What would they look like in the West? What's the science of them? But I think it's a real challenge. And so then as there's this excitement around, let's teach everyone mindfulness, from the boardroom to classrooms, to everywhere, and to athletes and soldiers and all over the place. Like, where do we start? Should we start with mindfulness, or should we start with values? Can we teach them together? And what values do we bring? Do we pull from values that are already kind of deeply rooted in our own culture? Do we think about universal values and try to find ways to cultivate those and then teach mindfulness? Or do we just start with mindfulness and hope for the best? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a great question, and you're doing a great service in this sort of worldwide look at it that you're doing. I go back and forth about this.
Yes.
Honestly. I know a lot of people who have a mindfulness practice who are still shitty.
yeah.
And or do
still an asshole. Yeah.
Do shitty things. And it's kind of flabbergasting, actually. It's kind of stunning. You see that in the spiritual environment. You see, whether it's in the Catholic Church, its issues, or you see it with in the Buddhist tradition. It has a lot of issues, usually involving men, who have a lot of mindfulness. They have a lot of wisdom, they have a lot of practice, and they still do really, really selfish, exploitive, terrible things. So I guess there's a part of me that thinks there's a middle way in which we really value mindfulness, and we don't get on our high horse and about there's not enough research, or it's not a universal thing, and there's too much hype about it. Harump. I mean, that's cheap. That's easy.
Right.
That's really easy to do. So on the one hand, I think it's appropriate to really appreciate mindfulness, but also to really understand it's not going to rescue us. Yeah. It's not going to rescue a school district. It's not going to rescue a failing marriage. It's not going to rescue a country.
Right.
is deeply divided and has had the foundations of civil society attacked, which are common truth and common justice.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think that, I guess I would just say from experience, I've seen a lot of crud go down in organizations, nonprofits,
Mm-hmm.
meditation centers that in which there's a lot of practice. Practice alone is no substitute for integrity and doing the right thing when it's hard.
Right. Absolutely. I was just discussing this with a friend the other day, but it's like, it's not just about being good on your cushion. It's really about what are you doing when you're off your cushion. Hopefully that helps you, but it doesn't seem to always translate as much as I wish it would. And as the longer I've been practicing, and it's been almost exactly 20 years, just over 20 years that I've really been, pursuing this path. Realizing like it's more than just practice. And so figuring out how do we really teach the rest of these values and teach people how to act out those values. And I think community is also really important. I think community really holds us accountable. I think there's often this like, everyone should go on retreats every year and this and that. And you and I are psychologists, are trained in that tradition. The way I hold myself accountable is I go to supervision and I talk to someone and they kind of call me out of my BS and tell me like what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong and where I'm getting stuck. That's holding me a lot more accountable than sitting in silence and not talking to anybody for 7 days or something like that. And figuring out how do we bring what we know does work or works a little bit better, hopefully, into this to keep the values and integrity going.
I think that's really well said. Really important. It reminds me of, Thich Nhat Hanh's line that the Sangha will become the Buddha.
Yeah.
There are ways to understand the meaning of all that, but you're exactly right. And when I've seen organizations or in a way politics broadly go wrong is when freeloaders, in effect, social freeloaders, are not called out and there are no consequences. And, as you know, in our evolutionary history, in small hunter-gatherer bands of roughly 50 people, 30 adults mainly living together their whole lives, essentially. In those environments, there was just a fair amount of identification and punishment, frankly, of freeloaders of various kinds, which created the conditions. Altruism could emerge.
Right.
Really beautifully. And where I've seen my own experience of cultic organizations or just right now the Twitterverse, the social media world, is that there's no punishment for freeloading. There's no punishment for trolling. Reputations are irrelevant. There's no reputational consequence. You can't confront people directly. You live with people day in and day out in a band of 50 people. You can get away with stuff for a season or two, but after a while, the consequences start building up and people call you out, right? One way or another, or you have to look in their face. These days, people say the worst stuff, or they publish the worst stuff. They just take shots at people without any kind of, in ways they would never do if they were sitting around the campfire with each other 20,000 years ago.
Right. And even, not just our leaders not having accountability, but our institutions that, just saw some study, I'm sure you've seen it also, about kind of prognosticators on TV saying the economy is going to do this or that. And it's like they are right no more or less of the time than the average person. In fact, if you look at kind of the law of groups, like groups are more likely, the betting markets are more likely to be accurate than those individual prognosticators on these kinds of things. And yet they're back on TV the next week and the next year. And it's just,
that's right. I know we're going to wrap up in a second. Maybe what this reminds me of, this is actually really, relevant to the parenting territory.
Thanks for bringing it back to that, by the way.
Well, it's relevant. As you know, the Buddha had a son, right? Rahula. And the Buddha abandoned his wife and infant son to go forth into homelessness, and we have to look hard at that. And I find it a really helpful thought experiment to imagine if the Buddha had been a woman and a mother rather than a man and a father. How that might have shaped the expression of the Dharma and the practices of it. Right. That's really we're thinking about. So there are these
on that mother for going to work to save the world.
I know. Anyway, there are these teachings having to do with the Buddha interacting with his son, some major steps along the way. And one of the first of them is his son's maybe 7 or 8, and the Buddha learns that his son has told a deliberate lie. Okay, and so the Buddha talks to his son, yo, Rahula, come here, let's talk about it. And I imagine that as a scene of high drama with Robert De Niro or Jack Nicholson playing the Buddha, or something, like talking to his kid, my dad, the Buddha. Like, oh my gosh. And you may know the teaching. Basically, the Buddha says in a fundamental essence, you should hold a mirror up to yourself continuously, Rahula, so you see yourself. So you were saying a moment ago about how other people, also in healthy ways in community, help us see ourselves. So you should hold a mirror up to see yourself. And then you should continually ask yourself, is this act of thought, word, or deed, is it beneficial for myself and other people? You should think about that before doing anything, while doing anything, and after doing everything. Ask yourself, is this to the benefit truly of myself and other people? That's such a fantastic teaching. It's so fundamental.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're talking about, really keeping in mind, even as we practice, is our practice beneficial for others?
Right.
We can feel that we're practicing for the sake of others.
Right.
While we practice ourselves. We can feel that we're practicing in community with others, even in our Insight Timer app. How many people right now are meditating worldwide with us together?
Right.
And there's no way around that kind of reflection. And in fact, that reflection is it's a fantastic driver of awakening to sustain that reflection.
It is. It so is. And it's so, again, thinking about what is it we're trying to educate our kids with, and what a lesson, if my kid gets nothing else besides, the ability to reflect in a way with integrity on that, to hold that mirror up to himself, or when he cannot, to find trusted people or a trusted group to help him hold that mirror, and for myself too, right? For all of us, right? What an incredible lesson.
Yeah.
And I think that benefit to ourselves, and we've got to stop in a minute, but this is also what's gotten me really excited is this question, is mindfulness contagious, or are the benefits of mindfulness contagious? And what we can actually see is we can see compassion and generosity actually are contagious in this kind of almost like karmic way. But mindfulness, even this recent study that was, it's like, we know parents that practice, their kids, kind of are, more present, and teachers that practice, and therapists that practice, that affects people. But there's a study about like college roommates, I think it was. And it's like the roommate was practicing, the weeks the roommate was practicing, like the other person, their roommate was like happier that week. They weren't necessarily more mindful, but they were. So it's like these benefits, we do practice for the benefit of others, and our practice does benefit others.
Yeah.
Like we're starting to be able to actually measure that, which I find just incredible. And again, as we come back to kids after this journey that you and I just took, right? It's like, it all comes back to the adults, right? Like we're the soil, we're the fertilizer for these kids' practice to grow, for their mindfulness to grow, for their compassion to grow, for all of that. And yeah.
It's beautiful.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a blast for me. I hope you and I find another time to talk, and I'm sure we'll cross paths at some point. Anything else you just want to share or leave our viewers with as we finish up?
Yeah, there's this quotation from the Dhammapada that I think about many times, and I think about it for children, and I think about it for ourselves, including in bleak times, in the worst times. The hardest times. It's this fundamental teaching. The Buddha says, think not lightly of good, saying, it will not come to me. Drop by drop is the water pot filled. Likewise, the wise one, gathering it little by little, fills oneself with good.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Yeah, look forward to being more in touch. And how can people learn a little bit more about you? Can you say just a word about your new book?
Thank you. The best place is to go to my website, rickhanson.net, where I have tons and tons of material freely offered, including, and also there are other things people can buy, but there are these online programs that are really well done. They're really accessible, and anyone with an internet connection can access them. So I would just encourage people, go to rickhanson.net, S-O-N. And my next book, working titled Neurodharma, that's probably the title it'll end up with, comes out in May 2020. It's really about the intersection of modern science, ancient wisdom, and 7 fundamental practices of awakening that, to me, are accessible to all of us. And as they are developed, they kind of start to define the pinnacle of human possibilities. So that's what that book's about. It's a very practical book, while at the same time being a really deep dive into the heart of deep practice. So anyway, that's what I've been doing.
And I can't wait to get an early copy of it. And your work, I think one of my favorite things about your work is how accessible and practical it is. It's like, here's what's going on in your brain, and here's what you can do. And it's so straightforward, but it has depth at the same time, which is not an easy feat. So that's why you're so good at what you do.
Well, I do it for myself too, you know?
Right.
Yeah, this stuff totally geeks me out from the inside out, right? Just like, wow. So anyway, it's so cool. Well, take good care, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Take care.